Everybody, this is Sherry Duttery, your classroom coach. You are here at the Writing Glitch. We recorded this the night before it went live in January of 2025. It's a live recording.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Impact Wednesday. We will do some introductions here in a moment. Let's give everyone a chance to jump on, and then we'll share our topic for tonight and give you a preview of what the next couple of Impact Wednesdays are going to look like and sound like as well. I am one of your hosts for this evening, Jonalee Zupanzik, Jay-Z in the house today for Impact Wednesday. Impact is impact school success. So how do we create experiences, environments, climates, and cultures in our classroom so that all students have access and all students have the same ability to achieve? That is what Sherry and I call impact, and I'll turn this over to Sherry Dotterer in just a moment. Tonight, we are going to connect to what we do in Saturday Math. Saturday Math is a once-a-month math training. It is also free, and Impact Wednesday is a connection to Saturday Math, but also an extension of adaptations for math, writing, and reading classrooms, primarily mathematics, because that is what our course focuses on. And to start us off today, this is not our topic for today, but it'll be our topic next month. There is a math book called Building Thinking Classrooms. It has made a huge wave in the States. It is quite an extensive movement, and Sherry's going to give us more insight into the adaptations and the non-academic accessibilities for students through this book next month. But the reason I mention it today is in Building Thinking Classrooms, Peter talks about in chapter 9 this idea of flow. Flow comes out of a true focus engagement. And oftentimes in math classrooms, we never pursue long enough on one topic, one task, one example, one situation to not only get the depth of the mathematics, but we also don't pursue long enough and leave things open-ended enough to get kids into what we call a flow state, what science calls a flow state, getting them in the zone so that deep thinking can happen. The reason I mention that is Sherry is going to talk to us tonight about the anatomy of the brain leading into flow state. But I don't want that to sound disconnected from what we've been doing mathematically. It's actually a huge connection, and the anatomy of the brain and how the brain responds to our instructional facilitation has everything to do with success in mathematics. And the bottom line is getting kids from focus to engaged to into flow state. So again, I'm your math specialist, Jonalee Zupanzik, and I will let Sherry Dotterer, occupational therapist, take off with the anatomy of the brain and how to get kids into flow state.
Well, hello, everybody. It is great to be here tonight. This episode will be sent out to the Writing Glitch podcast. We have two podcasts. One of them is Tier 1 Interventions. If you listen to the episode that was released yesterday, Tuesday, that was from last Saturday, and we did something we don't normally do with that. We released the entire hour and a half episode. And I also have a second podcast, and we're choosing this week to release this one right away, right behind it, so that you can pull from both podcasts, and we're going to link to the opposite podcast so that you can hear the other part. But Jonalee has done something even cooler is she has recorded a separate episode, which will be aired next Tuesday. So we're doing a lot of preparation here as we move forward to later on in the year because Jonalee has an event coming up, and all this is in preparation for that event. So, Jonalee, take a moment and share the June event before we get started tonight.
Absolutely. On Saturday, we talked about the science of math is coming. And on Tuesday's podcast, that intro dropped. There's large controversy. Well, there shouldn't be controversy, but there's large controversy on how we're responding to the science of reading. And we at Minds on Math have been studying the science of math for a while. It is coming. I don't know if it'll be here in 6 months or 6 years, but it is coming. That is guaranteed. And we are ahead of the curve with the collection of resources and data and research that comes with that. So we have our 10th annual June Math event this June 2025 on Thursday, June 5th. It is an in-person only event right outside of Columbus, Ohio in the States. And the title of the June event is The Cognitive Science of Math. And it is a collection of evidence, research, and brain-based strategies to begin to teach techniques in your classroom that increase memory, that increase retention of content, and increase scalable achievement for mathematics.
So, thank you so much for sharing that tonight. I am going to share my screen and we will get started with explaining how to engage our students in the classroom. Jonalee, you are in charge of the chat. So if anybody has anything that they are interested in relaying my way, let me know. I will keep glancing to those participants and making sure that I don't miss anybody who's waiting in the wings to come in. So, how to transform student engagement and success with your classroom or therapy sessions. Can everybody put in the chat right now before we even get started and move on from there? Who in this room is a teacher? Who is an occupational or speech therapist? And share what classroom that you are in. So please do that in the chat for me so I have an idea what kind of audience we're talking to tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I am an occupational therapist by trade. I have now retired from direct services. My shoulders couldn't take it anymore, but I am now hosting the two podcasts that we mentioned earlier. I wrote Handwriting Brain Body Disconnect in 2019, just as I was ready to launch a course that went with it. What happens? But COVID. So kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop. So I got a slow start. So during COVID, I got to participate in the writing of two chapters in two additional books. The first one's Becoming You, and it's an anthology. It tells a little bit of a backstory behind different folks that contributed to that particular book. I also had the absolute privilege to have a chapter in a textbook. Jonalee and I are currently writing a book, and I know we have a friend named Kirk who reminds us every time he sees us, when is this coming out? Stay tuned, stay with us. You will hear more as the year goes on. So on Saturday, Jonalee talked about interleaving, spaced repetition, retrieval practice, and metacognitive feedback. So if you want to hear more about what they are, you've got to go to Tier 1 interventions from the Tuesday episode. What to expect tonight? We're going to go through anatomy, okay? We're going to go do some anatomy of learning, the anatomy of the frontal lobe. We're going to stop at the frontal lobe. We're not going to go through the entire brain tonight. And I am not going to go through the frontal lobe in great detail. I want to give you an overview of the frontal lobe and how it impacts you as a teacher or a therapist in the classroom or clinic. And then we're going to really zero in on flow from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Did I say it well there, Miss Jonna Lee? So why does this all matter? Because athletes get into the zone, and that is when they win their gold medal. Those that don't get in the zone are the ones that either don't place, or when they get to the bottom of the slalom, they're going, I was just thinking about, and it wasn't what they were doing. I was thinking about some extraneous thing. Tonight, when we talk a little bit about flow, we have to have total concentration, total absorption into the task at hand. Does that happen at school? Let's see if we can figure out ways to help that happen at school. And it also improves our self awareness and gives us some brain based strategies to help engagement. At the end, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Counting and Writing Skills Builder Pack. With that pack, you can get certified as a dysgraphia specialist. Back in 2016, when I first decided, okay, I'm going to write this book, one of the reasons I chose to start writing the book was I'm sitting at home with my daughter. And my daughter comes in the room about fifth grade and says, I can't spell, Mom. And I'm looking at this evaluation, and I had this learning disabilities kid from school that day with the same issues. And I'm going, wait a minute, where's the connection? Is there a connection with a gifted student and a learning support student both having trouble with spelling? And what I discovered was, yes, there is. So you have some homework throughout the night tonight. I want you to take notes for yourself. What is a new experience and what is knowledge that you already have? So just on a separate piece of paper, I want you to do some homework, and we're going to talk more about that homework as we progress through this evening. So for now, all I want to share with you is experiences and already understanding and have a good knowledge base of that. Well, look at that. There is Denise Sherman. How are you, girl? It's good to see you. So let's look at the anatomy of learning. In this book, Brain-Based Learning by Eric Jensen and Liesl Munkunchi, I hope I said their names right, they give a definition of learning. Learning is the acquisition of knowledge, behaviors, skills, values, and preferences. And it's all built on one another. We have previous knowledge and we have new learning, and they have to come together at some point. And that is what flow will do, is it will bring the old knowledge and the new knowledge together and synchronize it. The components of learning. Every the typical a typical way of designing, whether it's a lesson plan for math class, a lesson plan for literacy, a lesson plan for social studies, and even an occupational therapy session, is you have some section where it's direct instruction, and then you have this indirect section where they kind of can work on what they've been taught. So those individual sessions. What I suggest is that we take a look at these components and find out for ourselves if that is effectively bringing us into a flow state with our students. When we get to flow, we'll learn a little bit more. whether direct instruction or indirect instruction is better. And I have little notes on here. We have vision. 50% of what kids are learning is visual. It could even be as high as 80%. 10% is auditory. Now, that could flip if you've got an auditory learner or you have somebody with a disability. So think about that as well. But typical kids, most kids, but 40% is learned with movement. John Lee mentioned building thinking classrooms. We're going to talk about that next month in Impact Wednesday. John Lee, what's the date on that? Can you look it up a while? So next month at Impact Wednesday, it's free. It's in the evening. You can come live, or we will be putting it on one of the podcasts. But in building thinking classrooms, one of the things he talks about in chapter 3, I believe it is standing up. And I thought, well, why does that have to be something that we have an entire chapter on? We do that all the time in OT sessions. In OT sessions, we're utilizing a lot of movement throughout our educational process. We're already engaging in those movement activities, and we're teaching the teachers the benefits. So a lot of you might see sensory pathways or sensory walkways so in your hallway to get kids moving, especially in the elementary level. You might see a sensory room in one part of the building, and it might have low lights. It might have a pit to kind of jump in, different things to create movement. And if 40% of how kids are learning involves movement, what about sitting in a desk? Does that create movement? Just asking these questions. So one of the things that Jonna Lee does in all of her instruction is she flips it. She does indirect instruction first. And one of the ways that she does indirect instruction is this technique called tell me about. Tell me about that. She could be putting up a picture of a diagonal line. Tell me about that. It could be as detailed as a picture of a scene out in the woods where people are camping. Tell me about that. It's amazing what kids make connections to. I love putting the diagonal line up for a couple different reasons. I like the diagonal line because it forces kids to think about crossing midline. When they're looking at it, they've got to shift their eyes up and down and cross midline. They have to think about it. Is it a positive or is it a negative? What other things could a diagonal line be? It could be headed up toward the mountaintop. So tell me about brings out all kinds of interesting thoughts with kids' conversation. One of these areas about learning that we don't always talk about is epigenetics. Epigenetics really is like this alongside the why can't I say genetics at the moment? Genetics of our system. It is how we feed our diet, how we exercise, what kind of disease processes are around our family, what kind of social contacts do we have, what is our microbiome. So looking at all of these other areas, non-academic, really do impact how kids learn. I have 2 children, my own biological children, who have very rare disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Probably I have it as well. We're doing workups, but they just found after 30 years of research is the chromosomes in the RNA that help identify it. Took a little bit of time. I haven't had the testing at this point in time. We're working on getting me to that testing to find out where I fall into that. But one of the things about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or EDS, especially the hypermobility type, is your joints bend in very unusual ways. For example, my daughter was a gymnast, yet she could dislocate her elbow and dislocate her shoulder and lick her elbow. I know it's gross, but she could do it, put her shoulder back in joint without any pain. You try that. I tried that. That's why I had to retire. I tried to dislocate it the hard way. Before I move off this page, I also remember I see lighting. Lighting can make or break kids. If you have the fluorescent lights on 6 hours out of their day, the sound, the electromagnetic radiation coming off of the fluorescent lights will impact their epigenetics. I suggest, and I talk about this all the time, have some floor lamps in your room and use them throughout the day at some point. Turn off those fluorescent lights. The other thing about learning, as we look at the anatomy of learning, is the biggest factor that's going to make or break a kid engaging in learning is motivation. Is it relevant? Does it create curiosity? Is there some autonomy and belonging involved in the way you're presenting the lesson? How are you empowering them? We're going to talk a little bit later on the challenge, stretch and non-snap and not snap. So I'm going to come back to that one. Validation, worthiness, meaning, purpose, and goals. So,
Actually, before we do the what do you see, what do you notice, just
sure.
to preview this next part that Sherry's going to talk about, but reflect on the strategy that she's just talked about. The greatest instructional tool to motivate students, meaning they have choice, they feel like they belong, they feel like I care about them, is that strategy that Sherry mentioned, tell me about. So if I am doing a therapy session or a reading session or a math session, when Sherry said I do the indirect instruction first, that is to engage and stimulate the student's brain to trigger focus. So tell me about allows the student to then engage, make choices about what they're going to tell me, make their own connections, relate to their past experiences and schema. And internally, they're saying to themselves, she cares about what I think. So the reason we're going on this deep dive of the brain over the next couple of months on Impact Wednesdays, and much of what we're teaching you may not necessarily be a grab and go strategy. The tell me about is you can use it with anything. And Sherry's going to show us some examples in a moment of what do you see, what do you notice. So these are very simple examples that get a great amount of depth in the brain, deep thinking, deep reasoning, and then ultimately that leads to deep learning. So we want you to push yourselves to start to understand a little bit more about how the brain works, because that is going to drive all of these outcomes that we're looking at.
Thank you. And all I was going to say about what do you see, what do you notice is it's another way of saying, tell me about. So I just gave you two different areas and two different takeaways. Tell me about, and what do you see, what do you notice? For those of you who haven't heard us talk about that before, that's what that is all about. It creates a discussion with the students so that we can embrace belonging and autonomy. So that is what I wanted to touch on, this little little tidbit of the anatomy of learning. I'm going to give you a moment here to think about what's the new experience that you had in that last section and what was new knowledge. Somehow or another, you can distinguish those, and you may not be able to do it now as we're going through the webinar here live, but take some time tomorrow and or if you're watching the replay, you can pause it and you can reflect on what you've learned. So, the anatomy of the frontal lobe. I had so much fun finding the anatomy of the frontal lobe, the pictures that I wanted to use today. So, one of the things that I have seen for the first time in Canva, yes, I'm using Canva, but I found the anatomy of a kid's brain. I want you to take a notice of that frontal lobe. Look how it's shaped. Look how their brain is shaped. Look at that cerebellum. Look how big it is. The cerebellum is controlling movement, it's controlling learning, it's controlling all of the refinement of activities that we're doing. The reason a cerebellum is so big in young kids is they are, toddlers. They're on the go. They don't stop. The frontal lobe starts to really develop around puberty. It doesn't finish developing until you're about 35 years old. That's all the way through college for most of us. So, the adult brain. I just highlighted the different lobes. We are we are still sharing that, right? Okay. I'm getting cut off here. I can't see everybody around the screen. You can only have so many places, right? Anyway, I digress. The purple area is the area we're going to talk about tonight. The parietal lobe interprets what we see. The occipital lobe makes it like a digital file. The cerebellum I just talked about, and the temporal lobe is for hearing and for memory. 1800s. This gentleman died in 1918. His last name was Brodmann. He made this roadmap of the brain that we call the Brodmann's areas. And as I was trying to find some distinguishing areas to explain what gets highlighted and what gets shut off during a flow state, this was the best way that I found to explain it. The yellow area is the frontal lobe. There's two parts to the frontal lobe that are in orange, and that one part that goes like underneath the temporal lobe, it connects the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. The pink areas are the motor cortex and the sensory cortex and the the eye cortex. So if you notice the section 8 there, that whole area controls how your eyes move. It's a huge area when you think about it. It's huge. So I've labeled all of the areas. Just taking some time. You don't have to remember these. And I'm not going to go haywire into them, but I just want you to see that they've done enough experimentation to find out different sections of the brain and what they actually do in that section. So I took them, I kept all the labeling. Those diamonds are what stays working. The stuff that processes consciousness are the ones that have negatives. So that stuff on that very outside of the bottom of the frontal lobe and the stuff, the primary cortex, what happens in flow is the brain likes to be automatic. So it wants to do things in repetition. That's why spaced repetition is so essential because it wants to know it so well it doesn't have to think about it. So the center section of the frontal lobe allows us to do things without thinking about them. We lose our sense of self. So although we talk about autonomy and we talk about belonging, that center section of the frontal lobe, we don't even know who we are anymore.
And Sherry, if I could just make a connection on that, we think about students that have issues with impulsivity. Oftentimes, boys will have much more trouble sitting still than girls in the classrooms. We talk about kids that have ADHD or kids that blurt out or kids, again, that kind of lack control and self-regulation because they're so impulsive. And what education does, what our classrooms do, typical traditional classrooms, is we work against those behaviors and not with those behaviors. So we actually want to take advantage of kids' impulsivity. We want to take advantage of, ADHD kiddos. Some of their strengths are creativity and hyper focus, not a lack of focus, but hyper focus. We actually want to harness the components that these, what we think are struggling students, but they are primed for flow state. And the way that we're teaching them and the way that we're facilitating our instruction and setting up environments and experiences for learning are working against those behaviors that our kids are displaying.
Thank you for adding that because those areas that are the diamonds get shut off in a traditional direct instruction environment. They get turned on in the indirect instruction environment. The yellow section is where executive function comes from. So, see what's required for learning? All of those stars. And what did we just say? Executive function comes out of the yellow, and the executive function stuff is quiet, but it's that hyper focus of executive function. Planning, organizing, and those higher level, they have to be more of an automatic phase. If you have to think about them, they don't work as well in flow. Welcome, Trish. Trish, you got here just in
Thank
time for
you.
all the anatomy.
Hooray!
So, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the function in flow is focus, working memory, and task-directed action. And that was that yellow section. The ventrolateral prefrontal cortex is impulse control and decision making. One of the things that they have discovered when somebody is in a hyper flow state, they can make decisions 1,000 times faster than they can when they're not in a flow state. The premotor cortex does planning and executive movements. If we have to be planning and thinking and processing, that's a little different than decision making. That's the section that it's active, but it has to be repetitive. So sometimes the premotor cortex can turn on and off in flow depending on what you are doing. The anterior cingulate cortex, this guy here isn't on that picture. This one is underneath what you were able to see as part of the brain. And it is like the big guy as far as flow states go. Attention, allocation, and emotional engagement. It is the one that It says emotional engagement, but what happens is your emotions get so hyper focused, your jaw actually changes shape during a flow state. It becomes more of a square and you frown because you're concentrating. You lose all that joy and sweetness. So when I have to laugh every time the music teacher says smile, because I'm trying to concentrate so hard on getting the music correct that I am more frowning. And now that I'm older, of course, then we have that added feature of all the collagen just draining out of my face. So I don't get to smile like I used to. But think about that when you're looking at your students. The kids that have the frown are concentrating more. It may not seem that way. They may seem mad, but they're concentrating more.
And I just want us
Then
to
the
think about,
deactivated portion, the prefrontal cortex, the medial area, that part underneath that was orange, and then a section called the default mode network. This is that allows your brain to wander and daydream. And that is all part of the frontal lobe, but that gets deactivated and shut down. The part of the brain that kind of identifies Sherry as Sherry or Terry as Terry or John Lee as John Lee, that kind of goes into an inhibited state. You don't really know that you're there. So that may have been more like the flow part, but it's the anatomy of what happens in flow in the frontal lobe. So take a moment, reflect what was new, what was old, what was a refresher or in between before we move on to section 3. Jonalie, do you have anything that you wanted to add before we go on to the anatomy of flow itself?
so the concentration and the frowning muscles, if and when we work with teenagers, we oftentimes will misinterpret. Teenagers are really deep thinkers. And so what often happens is what Sherry just described, we see a look on their face as they're trying to process and internalize and really engage. And we perceive that look on their face as inattentive or anger or upset. And many times as adults, whether it's in a parenting situation or in a therapy session or in, well, probably not a therapy session because OTs, you probably know more about responding to this than educators do. Or if it's in a classroom with students, oftentimes the adult will misinterpret and infer and then react in a way that is the opposite of what the child's brain is actually doing at the time. So just an awareness of this, I think, is very important.
So off to the anatomy of flow. Oh, this is so much fun. I love flow. It is when I found out about flow, my whole sessions changed with kids. As I mentioned earlier, motivation is the key factor to get kids into a flow state. I just repeated the slide that was on here earlier. So how do we get how does flow work? Well, it is neuroplastic. So neuroplasticity was discovered back in the 1930s-ish, 50s maybe, and it was the discovery that our nervous system continues to grow till the day we die. It continues to change. Even people who have had a neurological condition like a stroke, their neurological system continues to grow. It just grows around the part that died during the stroke. So, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to organize itself by forming new neurons and connections throughout life. The dynamic process enables the brain to adapt to the changes in the environment, learning new skills recover from injuries, and store new information. It's very essential with neuroplasticity to be prevalent in the areas of the brain that store memory, because if we aren't able to store new memories, we aren't able to grow new neurons, we're not going to remember. When the older person starts to forget that short-term memory, those nerves are starting to die and they have to create new ones. And sometimes it doesn't work that fast when they get older. So is the anatomy of neuroplasticity. What is happening with neuroplasticity is we're strengthening the synaptic connections. Those the dendrites and the axons wiggle together, and they have neurotransmitters that go in between them. We're strengthening those. The ones that are getting strengthened the most during a flow state is that center of the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral area. There are also two others. We talked about the cerebellum as well, that part in the back of the brain that helps with movement and learning. They create this really strong bond. But then there's a section of the brain that's in the middle of the brain in the limbic system called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are like the last straw in refining movement. One of the conditions when people are getting older that you can see issues with the basal ganglia is the Parkinson's shuffle. So they kind of like they can't get it going, and then all of a sudden they start walking, and then all of a sudden they get stuck, and then they go walking again. The basal ganglia aren't working effectively. People that have conditions like that have a difficult time entering the flow state. Or when they do finally get into the flow state, they can only be in it for short periods of time because there's like this hiccup, especially in the basal ganglia. The Hebbian plasticity theory is that neurons that fire together wire together. I've heard that term for many years. I never knew until today that it was called the Hebbian theory. The intrinsic, the inside the reward system, this is where dopamine gets fired. And we're going to talk a little bit more about dopamine here in a minute. This is where that dopamine reward center comes in. And then that suppression of the default mode network that has to do with, oh, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be doing this tonight kind of thing. And that whole aspect, that gets subdued when you are in a flow state. So what does neuroplasticity do? It encourages, it inspires, it helps that buy-in. One of the things that it does, and what John Lee has proven again and again, is it elevates that bell curve. It integrates learning. It builds on schema. What a word I have there. Sorry. It's very deliberate, and it consolidates memory. So when somebody's not having a memory issue, like they might have after a neurological event, then, and these kids with ADHD, they have strong memories. That flow state is building on that preferred task, and it's perfecting it to the point that we get to that analogy of doing something 10,000 times and you finally get it right. Who was that? John Lee, do you remember who did that? And I have a note here that it is indirect learning. And here is the neurochemical cocktail. If you do not have all 5 of these neurochemicals flowing through your system you will not enter a flow state. So you need dopamine, you need norepinephrine, you need endorphins, you need serotonin, and you need the anandamide. And I'm going to share with you what they do in just one more slide. So, what does dopamine do? Dopamine is that reward center. So, that's why video games on your phone are so addicting. They are sending off dopamine into your brain. They're doing the little snippets of flow. Unfortunately, we get interrupted much too often, and to be in an effective flow state over a longer period of time, it takes 20 minutes to get back when you're interrupted. So, for example, you're in a flow state. You are working really well, you're creating, you're doing whatever it is. Even if you're sitting at your desk and you're working there, you get a phone call. Totally derails your concentration. You take the phone call, and then when you go to get back to work, you have no idea what you were doing. Teresa's shaking her head, yes. It also is the foundation of where motivation, how the feeling of motivation inside our system. Norepinephrine helps us with focus and attention. So those kids with the ADHD, they have a lot of norepinephrine. Endorphins create your euphoria, and they also are there for pain relief. So an EpiPen is filled with endorphins. When you inject that EpiPen, you are killing the pain relief. You are putting somebody into a euphoric state temporarily so that they can overcome whatever it was that was creating the inhibition. Anatomine creates creativity and inhibition. I don't have time to share it today, but I'd like to challenge you to go look for on YouTube. Oh, shucks. What was the name of it? There was I think it was a Newsweek or 60 Minutes episode where they used this idea of getting a group into a flow state and how do we make the grocery store better? And they just problem solved for 3 days. They went out to the grocery stores, talked to people, and they created what we have today in some locations, especially at places like Whole Foods, because this was done out in California and kind of migrated east. Grocery carts that aren't the same as they are here in the East. So they have different features on them that like you can take bins out of them and put bins in and hooks and things on them. And it was all created when this group was trying to make grocery shopping better. And I believe it was a 60 minutes segment. Serotonin is going to help with calm. So that's why a lot of these kids who are anxiety driven are on serotonin uptake inhibitors. They are trying to regulate the anxiety and the calm with the serotonin. Individual flow triggers. So how do we get these kids into flow? We have to find their passion, their purpose. We need to create a little bit of risk in the classroom. Novelty is a great way of doing that. Creating a little bit of complexity, unpredictability. I know Janet Lane is on the call tonight. Janet Lane has taken a couple of classes with John Lee and I. And one of the activities that I share with her and shared with the group was a thing called the handstand flip. The handstand flip basically is the handstand upside down. So you're standing on your feet with your arms over your head. And the purpose of the handstand flip is to facilitate full extension of the body. Full extension of the body is and truly concentrating on pulling the abdomen and the glutes together to try and create some core strength in our students there's some other areas to it. But she does that, and she also does interlaced bilateral integration with a technique that I shared with her to help embrace both sides of the brain at the same time while kids are standing. She says the kids laugh, they carry on, they have great time in her class because she's unpredictable and novel. Flow triggers create pattern recognition and creativity. The arts are another area. Athletics is an area we talked about, but there's been many research studies of jazz singers and jazz musicians that the creativity that happens during some jazz sessions, they create the music on the spot just because they know intuitively what the patterns of the music should be. There's also group flow triggers and trying to get the group to work together. One thing about group triggers is you need to have small groups. Groups of 3 is ideal to get a really good group flow state to happen. Now, I promised you I was going to share challenge skill ratio. Jonna Lee always starts her lessons when she works with kids for the first time, somehow or another, with the number 8. It adds a challenge, but it doesn't stretch them so hard that they become so frustrated that they just shut down. So the idea of the challenge skill ratio is to stretch their understanding so that they get more out of it, more novelty, but not so far as to make it so frustrating for them that they just disengage. So that's the idea of the challenge skill ratio. And this is another little technique. This comes right out of improv, but yes, and. Whatever the student said, it could be, tell me about. Your response is yes, and. Tell me about, yes, and. It's a way of continuing the conversation. So in improv, one person will say that as they're ending, the next person says yes, and moves on and says their thing, and then that it keeps going around the room. The word but shuts things down. And I'm not talking about this back end. I am talking about the one with one T. But closes a conversation. Yes, and opens it up for further conversation. So, is anybody willing to share some new experiences that they've had this evening versus old knowledge that they've had? Think about that as I move on. Remember, I told you at the very beginning I was going to share the Counting, Writing, and Skills Builder Pack. The reason I suggested that at the beginning is when we are in one of the sessions, I'm going to be going even deeper into flow. We can only do so much in an hour's time. What do you get with this? You get 4 digital courses. They are not the same as the ones for the Mastery Math method. For those of you who are taking that, there are some differences here. You will come out of that understanding a lot more about literacy and what are some of the signs to look for kids who are struggling with writing, because writing affects math and literacy and social studies and music and art. You will get a bunch of worksheets. You will get handouts. We are giving some of them away. So the locker problem helps with learning automaticity and learning pattern recognition, parts of flow. visual motor control, spaced repetition, and that repetition engages kids in flow. And then we have fraction sense, time, money, and distance with the paper folding, which will help with fine motor skills. If you go to Eventbrite, I have a little thing on how OTs can work with kids using these 3 categories. So I have another PowerPoint that I share more about those 3 activities. And then we have the Data Dysgraphia method, where we're really going to look at the anatomy of reading and writing and really look at the neurobiology. And we do have a certified dysgraphia specialist in our mix. Wave to the crowd, Miss Teresa. You can share your experience with that. There is a practicum that goes with it, and that is monthly. You need to email me at sherry@sherrydaughter.com so that I can get you in the system correctly. If you want this system, if you are interested in learning more about flow, learning more about how it works with writing and mathematics, that's what the Counting and Writing Skills Builder Pack is all about. Go to sherry@sherrydaughter.com. My name is in the corner there. It's CHERIDOTTERER, and I can get you hooked up correctly in the system. What did you experience? The idea here, and we're going to talk a lot more about experience versus and knowledge here over the next couple months in Impact Wednesdays, but I wanted to give you a taste tonight. We're going to delve deeper into that over the next couple months. Did I give you enough value tonight that is anybody considering? You can just put a note in the chat. You don't have to raise your hand. The Counting and Writing Skills Builder Pack. In addition to what other things that you might be taking with Jonalee and I. And for those of you who are part of Tier 1 interventions workshops, we have something on Saturday. And then next month, we will have Saturday math. Jonalee will be sharing something fantastic, I am sure. And then we will do next month building thinking classrooms and flow. So we're really going to be concentrating on that chapter in the book next month and how flow interacts with kids in a building thinking classroom situation. So if anybody wants to read the book and be prepped, there we go. I hope you enjoyed this raw webinar on the writing glitch today. Go be awesome. Go be brilliant. You were put here for such a time. This is Sherry Daughter, your classroom coach. Have a great week. Talk to you next week.